can you just tell us what is this paper that you're responding to in the broadest terms? What does it do, and what do you do in response?
Yes, yes. So roughly, this is a paper written by three economists. I mean, actually, econometricians. Statisticians are they're kind of like a mix of statisticians and economists, and they've written this paper where they try to evaluate the effect of various non-pharmaceutical interventions during the first wave in the U.S. So by the non-pharmaceutical intervention in questions, they're mandating face masks for employees in public-facing businesses, closing K-12 schools, closing non-essential businesses, and issuing a stay-at-home order. And so what they did is that they use pretty sophisticated econometrics tools, so the kind of statistical techniques that economists use to study the effect of various policies or various events, etc. And they've tried to use this to evaluate the effect that those policies had during the first wave of the pandemic in the U.S. And so what's interesting about this paper, the reason I chose this paper and I looked into this paper is that it's actually much more sophisticated and careful than the average study on the effect of non-pharmaceutical interventions during the pandemic. So like most studies don't really pay attention to the fact or try to control for the fact that people voluntarily change behavior even in the absence of government interventions, and so this can usually bias their conclusions and all sorts of other difficulties. And this paper is unusually careful in that respect because they
Mm,
start from a realistic causal model,
yeah.
and the entire setup, the entire model is motivated by this causal model. So they think carefully about uh, what's the causal structure of the pandemic, and how interventions affect it, but how the pandemic itself affects what interventions are put in
Yeah, so this is
place.
important. It's not you're not straw manning. You're not picking on a paper because it's unusually weak. You
Yeah,
went you
exactly.
found what
It's
you
the
thought is
opposite.
the best, or one of the best econometric uh, analyses, statistical analyses of what do non-pharmaceutical interventions, lockdowns, etc. How well they prevent the spread of coronavirus and how many lives they saved. Right. So
Yeah, yeah,
what does the typical paper do? The typical paper just looks at an intervention. It tracks the date. It sees what happens afterwards, and it doesn't take into account any aspect of human behavior. Is that right? Or what people
yeah,
are going
yeah.
to
I
do
mean,
voluntarily
you
over the course of
basically have you basically have two kinds of paper. You have on the one hand, you have the kind of paper that epidemiologists write, and what they do typically is that they make extremely strong mechanistic assumptions about how the epidemic works, basically. And so they make ridiculous assumptions like the
Yeah.
only thing that affects transmission is government interventions. And so they completely disregard voluntary behavioral changes that people engage in response to changes in epidemic conditions. So basically, when people start dropping dead around them, they're not going to go out as often. They're going to get scared, so they won't be seeing their friends as much as they used to, etc., etc. And the typical epidemiological papers during this pandemic has completely ignored this, or almost completely ignored this. And then you have also people who use the more traditional econometrics approach, where in that case they don't really make strong assumptions about the underlying causal processes. They don't pretend to. It's pretty agnostic. Those models are pretty agnostic about the underlying processes at work that generates the epidemic. What they do is that it's basically they look at correlation. It's like what you said. They look at the dates at which such and such interventions were in place, and they look at whether if there is a correlation between this intervention being in place and the epidemic growing more slowly than it does when the intervention is not in place, and then they infer causation from this correlation. But the problem is that if I'm right, and I'm right, there is like a lot of evidence that shows this without any possible doubt, that people adjust their behavior voluntarily when the epidemic starts going badly. Then if you do this, the risk is that you're going to conclude that government interventions have a reduce transmission a lot, for instance, because when governments typically enact this type of policies, it's when things go bad. But when things go bad, it's also typically when ordinary citizens change their behavior in a way that reduces transmission. So you're going to attribute a lot of the effect that is really due to people voluntarily changing their behavior to the government intervention that may not be doing much on its own. Or, there's also another possibility, which is that precisely because governments tend to enact this type of policy when things are going badly, it means that when they do enact it, often, it could be that the epidemic is growing very fast. And so you might be inferring that the interventions actually made things worse but when really it's not the case. What happened is just that there is what economists call an endogeneity problem, which is that when the governments have tended to enact those policies when things were going badly. So of course, if you do a correlation, you might find that typically enacting this type of interventions is correlated with the epidemic growing stronger. If you interpret that causally, you're going to infer that the interventions actually made things worse, when in fact that's not the case. It's just this problem that it's difficult to infer causation from correlational data. And so for various reasons, I don't really believe this second possibility is a big worry. I think the first one is much more concerning in practice. But both are theoretical possibilities, and you have to. Most studies just simply don't really care about that sort of thing.